All right, welcome to Cloud Talk. This is episode number 3 on this October 16th. Hopefully everyone is doing very well. We are joining live again to talk pretty much cloud, technology, big data, and everything else that falls in between. How are you doing this morning, David?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. And of course, my partner and co-host, Daniel Newman, is joining us. How's Chicago today, Daniel?
It's dark and dreary, hence the reason my office doesn't look so bright.
Yes, so you're going to bring the brightness then, hopefully, since you're, I'm in Arizona, so this is the only time I can actually brag about weather, because I'm still in short sleeve shirts and shorts in October, so I can't complain about that.
So we've got bright talent on the show, which is good. You know, we've got a great conversation ahead. We've got some great partners in our friends at Avnet and IBM, as always, bringing us live with you guys. So thank you as always. And David, we're interested in kicking off a little conversation about cloud with you today. So if you get a chance, by the way, David, poke your head in on the Twitters because we've got your name going. So you might see quite a few tweets to you later. So you may have some questions to answer. Just saying. But I think that, the way we want to start this off, and Brian, I think you being the question guy, you always come up with the great questions to start it off, is cloud and buzz, right? So there's nothing better than buzzwords and buzz technology, but cloud is kind of a big deal. So talk a little bit about, cloud computing as a trend. Is it a game changer, or is it a buzzword, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think cloud computing is a game changer. I mean, I think I'm older than both you guys. And I've been in this business for a long time, and I've seen, kind of trends come and go. I mean, when I got out of college, it was the PC trend moving to client server, and then it was complex distributed computing. Then it was movement into the web, and web-enabled technology, which really kind of changed the game. And I think cloud computing is that kind of a catalyst. It's very similar to kind of the web revolution in the early 90s, and the fact that we could get at information that was commoditized in a very easy and effective and efficient way. Well, now we can get big data systems and enterprise systems and applications that were once reserved for just very rich enterprises, and gain access to infrastructure that wasn't there before. So it is kind of turning things on its head in terms of our ability to kind of consume IT resources at a cost point and an efficiency point that we just couldn't do in the past. So it's a revolution, very effective, and it's very exciting, and we just started.
And so, I mean, I guess, David, from your background, I know I'm amazed. 13 books on computing, so that's a big list of books and previous experience. But could you share just a little, I guess, on your experience and your path on technology, just give a little bit of background on not only what you've seen from the change, but kind of your role as that's kind of progressed through technology change.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people just kind of come around toward this way of thinking, in just the last few years. I mean, I've been involved with cloud computing since the late 90s. And really around the time when no one really cared. And so I was, part of the Grand Central team, getting that thing off the ground, which was one of the first infrastructure as a service, really kind of an ESP in the cloud. I was there with Randy Bias and a few other people that are in the cloud space these days. And just kind of watched the, progression of the technology in terms of something was instrumental or experimental and changing. And that's how things progressed, in the last 10 years. So it's been evolving in terms of our adoption and in terms of where this technology is going. But cloud computing, the thing that people need to remember is it's not scary new technology. It's building on existing patterns of technology. So storage is there, integration is there, processing's there, transactions are there, data's there, even existing data models and existing things we use in the premises there. We're just replicating it through another consumption practice. And in the thing that I've always held in terms of the reason cloud computing was going to succeed was the fact of the matter is we had to stop building data centers. We had to start doing things more effective and efficiently. We couldn't stand up really kind of massive amounts of hardware and software to support the enterprise applications. We couldn't afford to run these things at 1% utilization inside the enterprise. And so the ability to kind of share this stuff, either intra-company in some sort of a private cloud kind of a paradigm, or auto and self-provisioning is innate to it, and auto scaling is innate to it, or even better, a public cloud where we can all get together and share infrastructure that other people maintain and only pay for what we're able to use. The old power plant analogy, it's kind of beat to death now, but I think that's happened in the space. And just become to the point where IT doesn't necessarily have to require us to break the bank, and we can build companies rather quickly around IT services on demand. I mean, back when I was a CEO, it cost me $1 million in infrastructure just to get a startup off the ground with a handful of people. Now I can do it for $1,000 a month, and that's actually pretty complete array of services that are getting out of the cloud. Well, that's game changing. So that's starting to trickle up instead of trickling down to the larger enterprises out there, and of course the global one, the government. And they're starting to reap the benefits of cloud computing these days, and that just kind of makes it game changing. So the big thing is nothing changes really, other than the consumption model, and we're becoming smarter at sharing things and becoming more efficient at leveraging this technology.
No, I think you hit a couple of really good points there. My previous life, I worked for a data center company that we were making modules, and we were moving modular data centers, and then really working with OpenStack and playing in also between the enterprise cloud, the private on-prem cloud, and then also giving a link to that public cloud. I think that's one of the things that we joke. The last question we have every week is about what is the funniest or craziest thing you've ever heard about someone reference as what is cloud computing, because the range goes everywhere. And I thought your description there, especially leveraging or explaining the ability to start up, for a startup to used to have to procure servers or find someone that's going to actually give you data center space, or I guess it used to be in a closet, right? That's the width of the server is because it needed to be able to fit inside of a closet, which I've always found humorous for our technology. But when we talk, question 2 we have, how has data and companies increased use of analytics, anything data, affected cloud adoption? Because I know in a couple of your recent posts that was really jumped out at me, kind of your attention to really how data and analytics are affecting cloud adoption.
Yeah, I think data is the killer application for cloud computing, because one of the reasons, I used to teach database theory and design when I was a college professor years ago in my 20s. And one of the things we used to talk about is massively scalable databases and massively scalable analytics, where we're able to consider all the information that's native to a particular enterprise in sub-second response times and come back. And of course, when you actually do the modeling of that, it's going to exist in infrastructure that, quite frankly, was overly expensive and was not cost effective, and you just really couldn't build with existing technology. Now with cloud today, it's a game changer. I can put a petabyte-sized database in the cloud, or even partition the database between cloud and on-premise, and I can have all these things participate in my analytical processes. And with distributed database technology, MapReduce, Hadoop, and all the other things that we're building these days, the NoSQL stuff for sure, I'm able to bring that information back to me in a fairly short period of time, a few seconds, versus just 3 or 4 years ago with traditional infrastructure it would take a few days, and in some cases, one of my clients, it would take a few weeks to get the information back that they needed. So we're able to, number one, commoditize and make things affordable in terms of processing these massive databases. And number two, we're able to get result sets back in such a speed that we're able to integrate these result sets into our business processes directly. So we're actually able to automate making decisions such as inventory replenishments, things like that can occur in real time. And the big thing is I can see into the past in terms of what my business did in the last 15, 20 years, and also I can see into the future using predictive analytics as to where the trends are and where I should be investing my time and energy. In essence, make a much better business by almost having perfect information. And the cloud is enabling that because it makes it affordable and scalable.
So bonus question here, David, is big data is well, jump in between, let the Twitters talk, but big data is a big topic, right? Everybody's talking about big data as a whole. For the novices out there, right, and the business owners, right, big data doesn't mean much. It's kind of a buzzword again. It's kind of, so how are you sort of in your business explaining big data holistically to people into terms that really helps the average small business owner, or even large business owner, understand its power and its use and how it relates to cloud and computing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, you don't hear big data from me too much in my articles, but it's certainly the buzzword du jour out there. But ultimately, it's the ability to kind of take consideration into everything that's important to you and to make core decisions. So even if you're a small organization where you may have, a 10 gigabyte database, that's all you got within your entire enterprise. But the ability to leverage data services out there to look at risk analytics, to basically, look at inventory replenishment, whether the monetary values are going up or down if you're dealing internationally. I mean, there's thousands of data points. All you have to do is look at programmableweb.com, and I urge you guys to take a look at that at some point. It's run by a friend of mine, but you're able to get access to thousands and thousands of APIs that are providing, very helpful information to you. And you're able to integrate that information with your existing enterprise data and context, and therefore mash up and determine aspects of your data that you probably didn't know. I mean, one of the questions that keeps coming up now is whether or not big data is going to be a privacy concern because of the things, through some sophisticated algorithms and that I can determine about you guys and myself, or someone can determine about me, just kind of based on my behavior and patterns. And I think that enterprises who are in the game, who are going to leverage data as a strategic differentiator, need to understand that those things are there. And they can leverage those things inside their business processes, decision support activities, just to be a much better business and also make core decisions, back to the same term before, based on almost perfect information. And that should be something that's built in systemically to their IT systems if they're starting a business from the ground up. Now, their data may not be big, that's why I hate the term, but it's certainly strategic, and it's certainly a data-driven enterprise.
So maybe the next term should be relevant data.
I think relevant data would be awesome, but I don't think the writers are right about that. We love the sexy terms that trend up. Cloud computing was one, and now it's big data, and I'm sure it'll be something else coming up. I guess Internet of Things and a few other things that are popping up these days.
So David says small data. Small data is the next big thing, right? So let's jump into the next plan question, because I'm sure I'll come up with 3 or 4 more curveballs. In terms of like IT and job skills, right? So how is cloud computing affecting? So the person that wants to go into IT, in the past you might learn a trade, you might learn, whether that's the hardware or the software. Cloud sort of changed that a little bit, and it's become sort of a science in itself, right? So for the IT job, seeker or professional, what is cloud? What do they need to know? How are they going to evolve around that?
I think the way to think about it is systemic to everything you're going to do. So you're going to deal with storage systems and programming and app dev test, and now there's the movement into DevOps and all these other things that are kind of making a difference within IT. And I think that ultimately cloud computing is going to kind of become part of computing. I don't think in 5 years we're going to be talking about cloud computing. It's like distributed computing and client server and database technology, things like that. It will just ultimately just kind of sink into what we do within IT. So you need to understand that. So I don't think you can get into IT today without a significant understanding of cloud computing and be able to explain the differences in the consumption paradigms and the benefits of it. Because as you build systems, you need to consider all the technology that's out there in your arsenal as things you can leverage to make your IT systems better and to build better IT systems. And therefore, cloud computing really has to be part of that equation. However, I think the largest benefit of cloud computing in terms of people who are ambitious is the ability to kind of specialize in the technology initially, understanding that it is going to be baked into lots of different things, are baked into IT going forward. Becoming really good at becoming an architect, a developer, someone who can build these systems, specialize in storage, specialize in databases, and start ramping these things up. And I think that's that's kind of a fundamental change. So where I did a commencement address 3 or 4 years ago to a college. It was an IT college, and talking about the benefits of cloud computing. Ultimately, it was kind of a weird thing to do at a commencement address, but that's what we did. But ultimately, the core idea and the core notion was that cloud computing is just another instance of technological changes, and I think cloud computing is going to drive multiple other instances that we talked about: big data, we talked about scalable systems, we talked about highly distributed network environments and all these other things that are starting to come together. So if you think of it as a foundation of the change and the other changes that are going to be linked off of that, that's ultimately where the benefit is going to be to IT. And if you're going to focus on that as a career, that's going to take you forward for the next 20, 30 years. Be able to kind of spot things are changing, the changes are going to occur off of that. I made a career out of that myself, and I urge other people to kind of do the same thing.
Yeah, I always refer to it as, I was at my last company when we were hiring, we were moving much more away from data center and infrastructure skill sets, and we were more focused on some of the software, SaaS-based skill sets. I kept calling it a Swiss Army knife of skill sets because we had some people that were, either traditional DB or traditional networking folks that really were looking to do more and looking to, utilize some or kind of get involved more in cloud. And when they were able to broaden their skill sets to kind of understand, a little bit of all of the different pieces that make up cloud technology, they seem to be kind of succeeding in a faster rate, which I think is kind of the trend, almost like you said, where we're not going to be talking about cloud computing in a couple of years. We're probably not even going to be calling it social media in a couple of years. It's just the way that we are social. And I think as these technologies come, you have to be able to be agile, understand change. One of the things that I laughed about is, I remember taking web design and computer science classes in college, and I graduated college in '03. And the kids that are going there now, and I say kids very lightly, but they're coming out with the amount of IT skills isn't just like I was learning SQL and I was learning QBasic and some very older technologies. Where today I think cloud has changed it to where you're learning things that were probably invented or discovered within the last 10 to 15 years, where I was learning a lot of things that were a slightly older skill set.
Yeah, but I think that you can always build on that older skill set. I think that if you have a foundational understanding of computing, the patterns of storage, the patterns of processing, the patterns of compute, the patterns of data interchange. I mean, there's a list of probably 100 things. Not a lot of that changes over time. We have a tendency to kind of reuse those in newer technologies, and cloud computing is just another instance of that. Now, I think that in many regards, cloud computing makes it much better and scalable and much more affordable. But the patterns don't change, and people kind of have to understand that there's not new computing in cloud. It's just a consumption model, something that's going to be more effective and efficient, and not to minimize its impact. But it shouldn't be as scary as I think people think it is.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because you said, I think when you say it's a game changer, and I loved how you kind of explained it in question one. Sometimes people look at a game changer as meaning it's completely disruptive and changing everything we're doing, and rather it's one of the in one of your recent article on GigaOM where you're talking about 2015 and some of the changes that are happening. And I love when you focus on its agility and scale, and you kind of just talked about that there. When you talk about agility and scale, and I think you referenced it on the startup example that you used, what is, when someone hears, okay, cloud computing allows a company or a startup to scale faster or be more agile, what does that really mean for them today? Because I think they hear that a lot, but what does that really mean for companies and businesses today?
Yeah, agility is kind of an overused buzzword we keep throwing around, and I think people kind of lost touch as to what it means. I mean, scalability means you're able to in essence, get more resources online quicker than you could in a traditional way. I mean, you worked in the data centers, and I've lived old school as well. And if I wanted to, in essence, scale up a cloud service or scale up an application service, I had to go buy a bunch of servers and show up at the data center and get into my cage and bolt them in the system and test them and burn them in and then get them up and running and then put them online. And normally I bought about $1 million ahead of the need, and therefore I had depreciation and excess capacity and all those things came in there. And so the scalability of cloud really kind of allows you to just go to a console and start provisioning servers as you need them. You can even do it in an elastic way. You provision them for the need, say 15, 20 seconds of need in some instances, and then put them back where you found them so you minimize your bill. And it gets you away from doing that. And that was complete drudgery for me, especially when I was working at big corporations where I had to go through procurement cycles and go through the procurement organizations and things like that. And I guess that's one of the reasons there's a lot of shadow IT these days. The agility aspect of it is when the CEO comes to me and say, I'm working at a big multinational company or even a small SMB or even something that's like a startup size, and they say, we want to get into this business line or we want to acquire this company. Well, most CIOs know the drill. They say it's going to take, a year and a half to get the process changed, to get the infrastructure up and running, to get things changed over, all those sorts of things. And in many instances, that means they're not going to do the acquisition, they're not going to invest in the new product line just because of limitations of IT. Well, cloud computing kind of eliminates that. So I can get the infrastructure up and running that I need. I can change things as I need it. I can, deprovision my Linux server, and I can provision NT servers, for example, and move my workloads over there. I can decommission a database and move into a larger database, which may be better at doing strategic analytics, and move over there and do so without having to touch hardware and software, and be able to migrate my data quickly and efficiently, and therefore get things up and running in a couple, 3 weeks. Which used to be about a year and a half in the olden days. And I think that provides the value of agility, or the ability for IT to, in essence, keep up with the demands of the business. And that's the core, in my definition, that's what agility is. And I think that's ultimately what we need to do as IT folks. We need to be servants to the business. And if the business needs to change, we need to change around the needs of the business. Cloud makes that easier.
I love that, especially, it's funny how you say that, we need to allow, if the business needs to change, we need to be able to move our technology. So it's really like, technology is not the anchor or, the thing pulling us in every direction. I think Mark Andreessen yesterday at Salesforce during his keynote or his interview, he was kind of alluding to that from the startup environment, that, we have to think of technology and the business needs kind of working together, and I think that's something that sounds simple, but I think is a changing philosophy moving forward.
So let me jump in with another question. Curveball. Baseball. It's almost a World Series, right? Even if you're not a baseball fan.
Almost.
So the AAS, right? Not AS. AAS has been a big topic. Everything as a service. Now people are doing AAS for things that aren't AAS. It's like thinking as a service. It's another total buzz, but. So we have a mix, our crowd, right? We got social business tech people, marketing tech people, and then we have obviously your true cloud people. But there's platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, probably a few other things that I'm not smart enough to know as a service. But if someone came to you and said, explain PaaS, IaaS, and SaaS, and make it simple for me, how would you kind of explain those 3 layers to somebody, just to make it make sense to the average business person with a little bit of tech savvy?
Yeah, and I think those definitions kind of popped up in 2007 when NIST defined them, and I worked a bit at NIST under a contract back in 2008, and I think, and I know those definitions, almost memorized them at this point, and they've changed them a little bit, but software as a service is the ability to deliver standard software systems that we used to deliver on mainframes and PCs, which come over the open internet and are brought down to us directly to our mobile devices or desktop devices, and they operate as if they were local, either within our enterprise data center or on our desktops. And that's really kind of the definition of it. There's a very long, complex thing that NIST provides, but I think that's the essence of it. That's the layman's term. And it really was the foundation of computing. If you remember back in the late 90s, there were application delivery networks and some of the things that started to pop up, and they all went under like within a couple of years just because there was no interest in them. And the one that kind of kept going was Salesforce.com, which I remember even seeing back, in the early 2000s, and kind of looked at it as an interesting, kind of very cool way to do it. And they kind of helped define the market, but there were actually thousands of software as a service plays out there at the time, and they're still out there today. I think I was tracking 3,000 when I stopped tracking SaaS a few years ago. And that's because everything's as a service, so it's in HR systems and data services and all the things you're dealing with today. I guess they have dating as a service now as well. And then that was kind of a fundamental change in kind of how we were consuming technology, but it wasn't necessarily earth-shattering, because we had websites before, and websites had behavior, and they certainly look like applications. And something like Salesforce coming up, which was in essence an application built into a website, it wasn't that much of a huge honking change. Moving forward, we have infrastructure as a service, which kind of came up after that. And infrastructure as a service, as a pattern, is typically things you find in a data center. So it's storage, compute, services, anything networking anything that kind of provides the infrastructure to run the applications without being the applications themselves. Of course, there's lots of gray areas now. Infrastructure has some development capabilities. You can certainly deploy applications on it, so it becomes a SaaS. So, when does infrastructure service become a SaaS and all those things there? But just that you don't need to worry about that. That infrastructure as a service is fundamental primitive things such as storage and compute services that exist in the cloud. We're able to leverage as a service. S3 is the poster child for infrastructure as a service, but there's thousands of infrastructure as a service services out there and dozens of providers out there, they're providing bare metal clouds and access to storage and access to servers, different operating systems, all those sorts of things. So it's probably the most complex of all the cloud paradigms. Platform as a service is app dev test kinds of things, and it kind of popped up around the emergence, just to give Google its due, around Google App Engine, which was one of the first major platform as a service plays, which was around for a long time. With the ability to build, deploy, test, and operate applications. So it took the app dev stuff, which were environments that I ran for a good deal of my career, which are very tough to run, and put them out into a cloud where we could provision them on demand, and I could get access to the programming tools and the resources and the databases and all these sorts of things to allow me to build something. So SaaS is something that's built. It's an application that's static, that you're buying from somebody, very much like you would an enterprise system. Infrastructure as a service is things you typically find in a data center, operating systems, platforms, storage, the list goes on. And then platform as a service is everything having to do with development, for the most part. The problem is everybody defines it differently, and everybody has their own stuff, and they call it something as a service. And I always get pitched, they're trying to change the game, and they're trying to buzzword and all that sorts of things. I don't really care. And to be honest with you, I don't really get enamored around the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service kinds of things. It just was a nice, neat way to categorize cloud back in the day, and people still use it today, and I think it just causes less confusion if you kind of stick to it. But there's database as a service. You could probably argue that that is a category that's emerging these days, even though that used to be part of all three. There's security as a service, there's governance as a service, there's middleware as a service, integration as a service, all these sorts of things that are certainly legitimate spaces. But let's kind of stop. We're just confusing ourselves. Let's focus on what the technology does and not necessarily the buzzwords that are wrapped around the technology.
That's why I always like to go back to even cloud, and people really didn't realize cloud existed much before like the iPhone, right? The average Joe just doesn't even realize it. They still probably attribute cloud to Apple because they were the first to commercialize cloud, right? In terms of, I'm talking about pure consumerization, right? I mean, but then you go back and what was it like? When I think AT&T, and there was, was the ones that kind of first really stuck claim on it, but the idea of cloud computing went back 20 years before that. So, Brian, I think our claim to fame should be something like, we're changing the game of Twitter chats and online videos by using big data analytics to drive agile conversations, right, running on our platform as a service on the Google Cloud that's being hosted out of AWS. Okay, I've lost.
Yeah, we could play. Someone could play buzzword bingo with us, or rather it's shots with Doc, it's shots with buzzwords.
We thought social media was bad. I think the tech people in cloud are coming up with more than
I don't know. I did 9 years of government, so I said I learned from 9 years of Department of Defense where I had acronyms. Then I went into cloud and data center technology, which is acronyms, and now I'm doing mostly social business stuff, which is acronyms. So I feel like I could build a 40-page database on acronyms.
Yeah, we figure there's $10 billion of marketing in the cloud right now, and so those guys are getting paid a lot of money to go, figure out new ways to slice and dice the market, and it may drive you nuts, but that's kind of the way it goes. I mean, it happened in the SOA market, the integration market, the web emerging market, even back in the database market back in the day. And so it's just the way our market works, and you kind of have to abstract yourself away from it and figure out how not to get lost in the buzzwords.
Yeah, I really liked your definition of past because part of my previous life, I was responsible for emulating the Department of Defense NIPRNet with VMware. So we virtualized 200,000 plus nodes using multiple VM clusters and VMware across years of work out of the Marine Corps. And it was one of those things like we were doing it just as PaaS was kind of becoming more of a staple. And I remember looking back, like after all of the work we did, and it's like everything we stood up on physical hardware and had to have a physical location for was completely no longer needed because we could have done it in a much more, even more virtualized state than we were when we were using VMware world. So I think PaaS has been an interest, especially for the DevOps group. I've been to some of the cyber events there in Vegas a couple times, and just knowing what they're able to do now from a testing perspective, from a moving from beta into production, I think is exciting for cloud and innovation.
So let's talk a little bit about OpenStack, and I know we're talking APIs a little bit last week, and this week maybe OpenStack, but you got SoftLayer, AWS, Google, Microsoft, sort of running the public, the cloud, as a whole. So what do you kind of see as the future of OpenStack?
Yeah, I mean,
maybe give a quick background for listeners that are saying, "What the hell is OpenStack?"
Sure. OpenStack is an open source cloud infrastructure as a service standard that kind of emerged 3.5 years ago, I think. And it was about actually just kind of standardizing an open source, very much like Linux and other things that were operating systems, but allowed you to kind of come to a standard code base in doing storage and compute services and things like that. I actually developed at NASA, and I think Rackspace had a hand in it, and a few other people's had a hand in it as well. So Rackspace was instrumental in kind of getting it out there as an open source standard. IBM joined soon after. I think a couple of years ago, or a year ago, VM joined in, and it's got a good following in terms of dozens of major players. I mean, HP's in there, and who's who in terms of large enterprise service companies. But it's grown pretty well for the last 4 years. It just hasn't grown, I think, to the expectations I think that were initially set. So, and it's funny is I have a love for OpenStack, but I always call them out, as I need to call them out because so many organizations and people are dependent on it. And so where it is today is actually it's innate to Rackspace, it's innate to some of the IBM stuff, it's innate to the HP stuff, and it's pretty much systemic out there, and lots of folks are selling it. But the problem is that you have big three guys that are not typically chasing OpenStack, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, that just kind of went out there and just started to spend, and been dominating the market. And so the investments that the enterprises are making are not necessarily in private cloud, which really where OpenStack focused their growth. But it's been in the public cloud, and if it's been in the public cloud, it's around the big three that are out there that are typically non-OpenStack players. They work and play well with OpenStack and even have some OpenStack components in it. They're definitely not the poster child for OpenStack users. So I kind of believe 451's research, when they said that the OpenStack market, cloud computing market, I think in 2015 was going to be $1.6 billion, which is pretty big. But if you look at the cloud market holistically, which is about $30 to $40 billion, depending on who you believe, then you're only going to get into a portion of the market. And the worst news is that you're only a portion of that portion. So that 1.9 million is going to be made up of HP and IBM and Rackspace and VMware and everybody else who's driving into the OpenStack sphere right now. So they have to get some traction pretty quick. And they have to solve some problems that I think that they need to solve that their users are calling out. I think they've made some good strides in the last year. Very, very happy with the progress that they made. But now they exist in a market that's very different than when OpenStack was first released and launched.
Yeah, I think that's a big point right there. I was at OpenStack Summit earlier this year, and I think a lot of the conversation was around almost like a pivot where instead of I'd say going arm in arm and fighting the big boys, where Amazon has a profit margin that they can squash down, and Amazon's kind of driving the lead. I think the understanding that the need and the desire has shifted. I know we were talking at the event a lot about enterprise cloud, and one of the big questions I had asked a lot at that OpenStack event, I was doing some interviews and some man on the street stuff there, and I was asking about security, and it kind of works well into a question we got from Rob Peters on actually in Google+. He had asked, the banking industry has been slow to adopt public and hybrid cloud for operational risks, security concerns, SAS 70 audits. Is that is there being a breakthrough in that element where security and accessing the cloud is now becoming a little bit easier or better to understand, or is it still something that is hindering cloud adoption, especially for industries like the banking or government or healthcare?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the reality is it becomes to kind of a control thing. So security and your ability to secure your information and your processes and your applications is really dependent on the technology, processes, and talent that you put on it. So you can have an extremely secure system in the cloud that's nothing's foolproof, but certainly much more secure than most of the on-premise systems. You can create an on-premise system that's lacking security. In fact, if you look at the hacks that occurred in the last couple of years, primarily they've been after on-premise systems. The most recent Home Depot, they're not hacking things out of Amazon. They're hacking internal systems. And that's because over time they leave exposures, they don't patch things they need to patch, they become lazy. Where if you're in a cloud, the cloud provider's interested in keeping things secure, and so they're going to basically make sure that you're up to date with all the fixes and patches, and they have continuous delivery, continuous integration, continuous deployment. So every time you log into the system, they probably put a half a dozen things in there that weren't in there the last time you logged in, and so it's going to be fairly secure. However, when you deal with banks and you deal with healthcare organizations where there's a lot of compliance issues, they're concerned about if they don't own the data or it's not there on premise, that they're not going to be able to control it. My advice after trying to argue logic with guys over time is that if it bothers you and you're not comfortable with information being in a public cloud provider, then don't do it. That's just kind of the way it is. And they go, well, is there a technical reason I can cite? No, it's absolutely, there's no reason at all other than some compliance regulations such as in Europe and things like that. We have to be able to control your data in some reasons, things like that. But even in the case of HIPAA and even in the case of a lot of the financial regulations, there's no barriers and reasons why you can't stick the majority of those things in public cloud providers if that's the best platform and that's the most cost-effective way to do it. It's just a matter of I don't want to do it. And it makes me uncomfortable doing that. And isn't it less secure? And I always go, well, no, it's not less secure. Well, no, that's what everybody says. No, let me show you 3 or 4 surveys where that's not the case. And let me show you the breaches and hacks. And they talk about outages. Well, how many times have your internal systems gone out in the last month? 5. Well, how many times has Amazon or Microsoft gone out in the last month? Maybe 1 sometimes, but for the most part, the outages are few and far between. And the same thing with security. So you deal with these kinds of perceptions out there that you have to kind of get around. In many instances, they don't listen to logic. They have their own ideas. And my take is, okay, if you're not comfortable, don't do it.
No, I think it's funny because the illusion that if you control it or if you have physical access to touch it, that it's more secure is something that not only did I deal with that in a cybersecurity world, but we build modules at my last company, and the modular data center, a lot of the times having them on-prem was just so that you could actually physically see it and look into it, from a perspective there, and it wasn't on a closed network. It was still being accessed as if it was a public cloud. And one of the things that I thought that you said there that was, it's really so much of it is a change in the way they're thinking and really what security means. I mean, when I was working in cyber, the biggest 2 threats were physical security and insider threat, right? So when we were in the Pentagon, we weren't worried about it. I mean, the Chinese, of course, were worried, but the employees leaking things is what caused the big issue, and that was on-prem data and those elements. And I think one of the things that really caught my attention in your post on the future in 2015 was really the attention to cost of risk and total cost of ownership. I know I've sat through multiple TCO models and looking at that from especially enterprise companies. So when you think about the TCO model in 2015 and that cost of risk for enterprises specifically, how is that going to change in 2015? Is it going to be them understanding it more, or is it the risk versus reward is kind of going to come into a better picture?
Yeah, I think it's getting more of a consideration. I mean, my firm does a ton of those. And normally they're very complex and domain dependent. And the reality is that you're finding that cloud is, in many instances, cost effective, but not always. And in some instances, some cloud platforms are cost effective, but not others. And it gets into very complex, kind of convoluted kinds of logic. And I think enterprises are asking that question now. So it's not like whether I should cloud or not. They see the writing on the wall that cloud computing is, in essence, a future of computing, and they got to figure out how they're going to play, but they're trying to figure out what are the most cost-effective workloads to move in the public and private cloud, mostly public cloud. And they're becoming a little bit more savvy at that than they were just a few years ago. So I'm not having the very rudimentary explanations in terms of the benefits of cloud computing. I think they get that. I'm having more explanations in terms of workload profiling as to which ones are going to be most beneficial, and moving them into what cloud, what type of cloud, how much it's going to cost, the cost of risk. To your point, the point you just made, I think I made in my article, security concerns, governance concerns, and ultimately targeting to get them to a much more effective and efficient state than they are now, utilizing the cloud. I think if you just get what you got now in the cloud, that's not a success. If you're able to get to a much better, scalable, manageable, and just easier to deploy and more cost-efficient environment, that's success. And I wouldn't recommend anybody move to the cloud unless they can gain those benefits.
That makes so much. And then when you think of, is the enterprise still kind of focusing on the all or nothing where it goes public cloud, or is that notion changing where now they kind of understand that newer applications, some of their BYOD solutions can now sit more in a public cloud where they still have to change the architecture of older school applications that are writing locally? How is that affecting in that enterprise cloud conversation?
Yeah, I think that they are considering what the applications do, as they're moving into the cloud. I mean, we just had a major milestone. We have 1% of our IT systems in the cloud,
wow.
As of now, right? And that's amazing because it was probably 0.00001, a few years ago, when I was kind of monitoring the market. And I think it's becoming mainstream. And so a GigaOM survey that we did a couple of months ago, when we looked at how the deployments were going, we find that most organizations are really kind of at the we're moving to maturity standpoint. So they've done 3 or 4 cloud deployments. They have, say 10,000 instances and workloads that are running on the cloud currently. They're currently involved in a migration strategy. So I think it's kind of baked in as really just kind of an optional platform in how they're going to drive cloud computing, into their enterprise is something that is workable, has been proven, and something they're able to leverage. And I think that's how it's being considered these days, which is news, music to my ears, because we can get to where cloud works or where it doesn't, and figure out where the applications should reside and how the workload migrations to occur, and also identify the things that shouldn't move to the cloud. A lot of high-end transactional databases and high-speed, high-performance systems, many things that have really kind of odd workload profiles. In many instances, they're not going to work in any public cloud, and people need to kind of understand that up front.
It's interesting too. So you say 1%. People, as much as we talk about cloud, I think right, 99% aren't in the cloud. How do we get there? In your vision, what's going to be that tipping point? My favorite guy is Malcolm Gladwell. What's going to be the tipping point for this industry where cloud becomes more than something we talk a lot about and then utilize in very, very limited sort of vacuums of our lives and become really part of the everyday experience and not just conversation?
Yeah, I think the tipping point is probably a couple, 3 years away, to be honest with you. I think it's probably 5% of our IT systems, and we're going to get there as quickly as we can. You got to remember the immense number of IT systems that are in production these days. So 1% is a fairly significant amount. But I think when we get to the 20th or 30th project, when we get to, say, a 5 to 10% utilization, say within the public cloud, I think that'll be the tipping point when they realize that Armageddon didn't happen, which I think everybody is predicting. People think that if they move things into the cloud, that their data is going to be at risk, that the NSA is going to be culling through it, maybe they are, and that all these bad things are going to happen. Once they realize these bad things haven't happened, I think everything's going to be fine. I mean, it's analogous to the adoption of the web, back in the 90s. There were a few guys experimenting it with Gopher Space and things like that, like me, and the mainstream wasn't getting into it. But once people realized the value that the technology could have in terms of information dissemination, which is really what the initial web was all about, then suddenly everybody adopted it. I mean, I was working for a big company. When I had to research articles, I had to go down and use the ALL system in the library in 1996, just because of the fear of it. And then ultimately, they just kind of adopted it fairly quickly. And I think once they reached kind of the 10% saturation point of the various systems, and the movement was going to be fairly substantial. Same with client-server distributed systems, and moving from traditional mainframes and those sorts of things. And I think cloud computing is going to be no different, and it's going to be a little bit longer to adopt just because of the learning curve and the ability for enterprises to kind of understand the value. But once they see it, especially once they see their competitors leveraging it to their advantages, and they see it becoming a core advantage of what they're doing, then that's the tipping point. Then it's Katie bar the door. It's politically correct to do it. Everybody's going to start moving in that direction, and everybody's going to have amnesia around the arguments that they had with me a few years ago about how cloud is no good and it's going to go away.
So you use the term Armageddon, which I like. Right now there's so much talk about these breaches, all these retail breaches and data breaches that are going on, right? Just the other day, there was the big one with Target, but there's been dozens more since then, right? Can you just speak a little bit to how the cloud layer impacted that? Were all these companies running public clouds? Is that why these happened, or does that have really less to do with it, and most people are just unaware and blaming it, thinking it's a public data issue?
Are you talking about like the iCloud issue, or are you talking about
that one too? The one where, the iCloud where they hacked them, but then there's been these retail, like these credit card retail breaches and all these retail chains. And I think a lot of people attribute this though to cloud. They're thinking that it's because people are hacking in the cloud, and they're not understanding that a lot of these are private, or companies that have private clouds or their own data center. And it's not part of the public domain. I just think it'd be interesting to hear an expert speak to that.
No, it's not. And if you look at the profiles, they were internal systems, and everything internally is connected to a network, which is connected to the internet, which is hackable. And so to make information available to people who need to see it, you have to expose it over networks, and then hackers figure out how to get in it. But it's nothing to do with cloud. It's traditional systems, traditional designs. And if you look at the Home Depot, Target, the Sony one of a few years ago, I think I've tracked a ton of them. I looked at all of them. Cloud is not going to be a factor there. In fact, it's not touching any sort of cloud computing system. So that's just kind of the way the press has a tendency to spin it. I mean, the iCloud system the iCloud hacks were kind of interesting, but that was more of a password issue than anything else. So everybody was guessing passwords, and I think I had Dana Gardner, who was on my podcast, and he brought that up as an issue. I think he was spot on, that this becomes kind of an indication of we have to kind of think of something different in terms of how we identify ourselves versus just passwords, which many make as simplistic and easily guessable, which is what happened with the celebrities in that case. And by the way, I'm not going to defend cloud as being infallible. I think we are going to have some hacks that pop up in 2015 and 2016, and we're going to learn from them. But I don't think they're going to be as many and as exposed and as scary as the ones that are going to occur with internal systems, just because the internal systems are getting old and people are figuring out how to get in them.
Yeah, I think that's important. Ben Haynes, the CIO over there at Box, he jumped in on Twitter and just made the comment. The limitations on applications moving to the cloud is really industry based, and I know Ben is a friend and so on. I hear him talking a lot about when people freak out about a cloud security breach, they immediately have amnesia and believe that there's never been a cloud security breach on-prem or outside of the cloud. And I like how you kind of referenced downtime and those things that when the cloud goes down or when you can't access, everybody jumps on and blames the cloud. Yet things go down, if not more frequently, just as frequently on-prem. So I think products like Box and things that many consumers and many of our community are used to using. And we're in a community now where I expect everything to be on 24/7, 365. It's not like the older days of, I remember even going to a couple of the data center conferences where 99.9 was the best of the best, and now we want 100%. It's, if you're not staying up 100%, that kind of freaks people out. And so I think it's an interesting philosophy. I think we have to change the way people look at security breaches and downtime.
I think one of the problems too, Brian, is that the education, there's like two levels of education about the cloud. There's David and people like him, and there's everybody else. And I'm not saying that, I'm saying like there's the people like you that are immersed in it, that really understand what this means. And then there's the rest of us that think about like I said, the Apple Cloud or Google Docs, and that's the cloud to them. And there's this big gap about, like, someone said it on the Twitter. It's like, we struggle to see cloud is different from the internet, in terms of vulnerability. So internet vulnerability versus cloud vulnerability, because you access all these sites from the cloud, but whether they're public, private, hybrid, cloud, or on-prem, you don't know. It's just like you said, David, they have to be made available if people want to view it. So.
Yeah, they do. And so anything that's going to have value, you're going to have to connect it up to a network, which means you're going to be vulnerable unless you put a good security approach and technology around it. Cloud's no different.
Absolutely. So kicking off 7, so the last question before our fun question of the day, and then we'll get you out of here. What are the technology trends that you're most excited about? Like, what's kind of coming next? Cloud, not cloud? This is kind of an open forum here. Talk about what you're excited to see.
Well, I think it's also cloud related, but the device connectivity and our ability to kind of, which has been going on for years, by the way. The Internet of Things is not new. We've been doing Internet of Things for a long time. In fact, I think the first use of the Internet I saw was connecting up a Coke machine and also and to a coffee machine. So we know it's done. But the ability to kind of have our devices, leverage cloud-based resources to think. The ability to kind of my car and my motorcycle to communicate, with a database and have analytics kind of monitor it to see if there's core systems that are, likely to fail. And so I can, get something in my ear that says all systems go, but breaks at 30%, and I did get an error code from it, and so likelihood of failure is 0.001%, in this particular ride in the first hour, and 0.0, and it sounds weird, but and probably shouldn't be as technical as that. But the ability for these devices to spin off information which is meaningful in the cloud in terms of the ability to do complex data analytics and come back with answers, to make things safer and better for us is I think kind of the next big destination for this, which is related to what we talked about in terms of big data and related in terms of analytics in terms of businesses. But that's interesting to me. The Nest thermometers I have in my house, their ability to kind of, keep in track of what I'm doing and then adjust the thermostats effectively and efficiently to save me money and save dollars, the ability to kind of operate more effectively and efficiently in terms of how we deal with automobiles and airplanes and transportation. And I just think that's just a hugely interesting area to me right now.
I agree. I'm excited about it. I said on the last one I have 41 connected devices in my house, and I have a 5-year-old, or a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old, and my wife and I. So I have, so many connected devices. I wear Pebble and Fitbit devices because to me, so much of that is, this data that we now have available to us because of the cloud or enabled because of the cloud is definitely exciting. Especially as it goes into even more devices, Wemo devices and Nest, and even I like, the concepts of, some of the Hue lighting. I have a If This Then That app that whenever my wife is pulling into the driveway and she hits the Wi-Fi network for her iPhone, my lights blink in my living room so my daughters know that my wife's home. And little things like that are things that, are cloud-enabled devices and some, technology that is definitely consumer fun for sure.
Well, if you have Wi-Fi device on your dog, you're a man after my own heart.
I love it. All right, so we're going to jump in. We have about 5 minutes left, so we'll jump into this question 8, and then love for you to give us some, some of your things that you have working on, your podcast and your stuff. But question 8 is the one we ask everyone. What's the craziest or most interesting explanation you've ever heard for what is the cloud?
I think the craziest explanation was, anything outside my enterprise is the cloud. And I've gotten that a few times. And, of course, I kind of think in certain aspects they're right, but mostly they're wrong. But it's always kind of struck me as something that's a bit nuts.
Wow, it's almost like anything I can't see, right? Anything that's not in the walls that I control. That's an interesting discussion for sure. And this, we really appreciate you coming on. Our sponsors, IBM and Avnet, really kind of allow us to bring on, industry experts. I've been a big fan of yours for a long while. I know not only studying, the posts and things that you've written, but I also appreciate that you're very social savvy. You're, engaging on multiple social networks and kind of always there for conversation. So give us a little bit. How can people get a hold of you? Where can they listen to you? What do you have coming down the pipe?
Sure.
When's your 14th book coming out?
Yeah,
I'm not sure I'm going to do another book. Is it? Tell you what, with the social stuff these days, it's just more fun to write articles and get the immediate feedback than it is to, take a year to write a book, and you do get feedback on it, but it's definitely not immediate. But I'll probably knock out another book in the next couple of years. Well, anyway, you can find me. I'm an SVP, Senior Vice President, Cloud Technology Partners, which is a cloud strategy and consulting company. CloudTP is the .com is the address there. We do a podcast via CloudTP called the Cloud Computing Podcast, and it's you can find that on iTunes, and it's been around for about 2 years. And I've been doing a cloud podcast since I think 2006. And also GigaOM lead cloud analysts. And you can find me out there on their site doing lots of reports on cloud technology. I just did a report on PaaS, just a report on cloud security. Love doing that because it allows me to kind of dive into the technology deeply and kind of think about it conceptually. Also, cloud blogger for InfoWorld, and I'm also the cloud blogger for Search AWS and the cloud blogger for Search Cloud Computing. And I think that's about it.
I'm not sure if you could write more books or be in more locations. You're leveraging the cloud to be a little bit of everywhere.
I'm a cloud whore.
We need to upcycle him.
Yes, we do.
Well, that's great. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time, David. It's actually 11:59, so we wrapped you up with tons of time to spare. To our community out there, listeners on Twitter and the people watching the show live, I want to thank you for stopping in. Check out David. Check out his stuff. Visit his sites and all of his blogs. I'd list them off, but I can't remember them all.
Well, they'll be in the post recap. We'll put all those links in the post recap for sure.
We'll put them all in there, and until next week, same time, same place, and same bald heads. I'll see you guys later.
Bye, guys. Thank you.